Welcome to Don't Get Rusty, where we have fun chatting about the topics that will help keep you proficient. I'm Keith West, and today our webinar is Knocking Off the Rust. What could go wrong? We're going to be talking with Pat Brown, who is a DPE, flight instructor, and AOPA Ambassador to Texas. But before we introduce Pat and our other panelists, let's go over a couple things that will help to explain the webinar. There are a few things different this week. First of all, the webinar is recorded, and we will be sending out links to the recordings right afterwards, and so that you can watch it at your leisure if you should have to log out early. Also, for the first time this week, this webinar is eligible for Wings credit. The process is automatic. We will be uploading everybody who registered into the FAA website, and you shouldn't have to do anything to get your credit. If you do have a problem, after about a week, get in contact with us and we'll track down and see what might be wrong. This week, we also have a new registration process. As you were registering, you're actually registering for the series of webinars so that you won't have to re-register each week and all the inconvenience that entails. So for next month, throughout June, we will be weekly, just as we have been for the last couple months, and the webinars will remain at Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern. After June, we will be going to a monthly schedule. It'll be the second Thursday of each month, also at 12 noon Eastern. Now, and as this series, you will receive a reminder the day before each webinar. If you're not interested in that topic, or you're just not going to be able to make it, you don't have to do anything. You will receive an email with a link to the recording so that you can watch it once again at your leisure. And if it's just not your cup of tea, you can cancel the registration at any time. Now, we do have a lot of new people who haven't been on the webinar before today because of the Wings credit and the FAA announcement. So I just want to emphasize that we are not professional webcasters, and we have no pretension to that whatever. Our idea is to have some fun talking about serious aviation topics, and it's just kind of low-key, loosey-goosey. And so if we're going to have opportunities for you to be able to present or to interact with the panelists, which we will go over right now. So if you are using a computer, you should see something like this. So you're just seeing a tiny tab. That means that it's minimized, and if you use that white arrow in the orange tab, that you can see the full panel there and be able to modify what you need. So you can see everybody today is muted. So that orange button there with the mic is muted, so that you won't be able to actually talk on the webinar today. But if you look at that audio panel there, you will be able, if you're not able to hear it, to switch what you're hearing it through on your computer. So this is how you interact with us is through the question panel. You see the question panel there, and receiving your questions will be Pablo, who we will introduce in a second, and Stephen, who is our producer. He is off camera today, but he is with us. Say hi, Stephen.
Hello, everyone.
And so we will look forward to talking with them there. And now, if you are using some sort of mobile device, a tablet or a phone, then you should see a presentation that looks something like this, and you can see the microphone there. And once again, everyone is turned off today, and you'll see settings so that you can change whatever settings you might need to. And if you need to ask a question, you'll see that little question mark, and that's how you will enter panelists send us questions. And we will have question session at the end of the webinar, but if something occurs to you at any point during the webinar, our screeners will take a look at it and put it in there. And so we will try to get all the questions answered today that we possibly can. So introductions. My name is Keith West, as I said, and my title is Senior Director for Flight School Business Support. I work with flight schools to be able to deliver a better flight training experience. We are joined by Chris Mosier. Chris, introduce yourself.
Thanks, Keith. My name is Chris Moser, Senior Director for Flight Training Education. And so I work also with, just like Keith, on the same team, working with CFIs in schools, and I do sort of the educational design and the stuff along those backgrounds. And I'm happy to introduce Pablo. You're up.
Thank you, Chris. I'm the Senior Director of Flight Training Technology, and I deal with all the technology-related stuff over here at You Can Fly, including an app, an in-cockpit training app we're doing. So happy to be here. And I couldn't be more honored to be passing it over to an ambassador in life and in flying before you can fly. Pat Brown. I can't do you justice. Go.
No applause, please. Save it for the end, as they used to say. Now, my name is Pat Brown. I am indeed the Texas AOPA You Can Fly Ambassador and a designated pilot examiner. And I couldn't be more thrilled to be with you today. It's going to be fun. And by the way, I do intend to add the appropriate amount of unprofessionalism to the group.
Glad you're on board, Pat.
Yeah, okay, yeah, let's just leave it at that. Okay, so for the interactivity, we are going to roll a poll because we love polls, right? Stephen, can you display this poll? And it's how long has it been since you've been in the left seat? And so we will watch here as the poll results come in, and as soon as they stabilize, we will reveal the results because that's fun too. Oh my goodness, look at this. Wow.
Hey, and Pat, while we're waiting for the poll, Mike Stone, a former Rusty pilot, has returned to active status and he says, hello, sir.
Oh, excellent.
We love our Rusty pilots. Congratulations. Yes.
Thanks. Now, Mike, I'm gonna shame you in front of about 500 people right here. The last time I invited you to come out to dinner, it seems like you had something to do with your wife. Maybe that should take priority, but remember, you're a pilot. I'm going to hear from him.
Okay. All right. It looks like the numbers have stabilized. Stephen, let's reveal the results.
That's pretty evenly spread there.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, look at that. You know, I'm surprised at how many, because, you know, the whole title is Don't Get Rusty. And look, it looks like we have 30% who, you know, are fairly legitimately rusty. So we have a program for that too.
Yeah, that's the perfect time to talk about the Rusty Pilot program for sure.
Exactly. And Pat is one of our presenters for Rusty Pilots. And Chris Mosier there. Chris, what was your role? What is your role in Rusty Pilots?
I'm just the one that sort of designed and wrote the current version of it, so that was a lot of fun, and it's kind of cool to have it out there. And in fact, I believe, Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a webinar tonight, I know with one of our ambassadors happening, and then on a regular basis. But do you know more about how often those are being scheduled?
You know, they're kind of random right now, a couple of times a week. Kay Sundaram, who is my colleague, our colleague out in California, she's our You Can Fly ambassador out there. Kay is doing that tonight. I think at 7 p.m. Pacific time, but I'm not sure of the time.
Okay, Pat. So I have handed you off the presentation, and if you would accept that, we are going to give you the yoke.
Okay, let me see.
Is it like a flip over yoke in the Bonanza sort of thing?
Something like that. All right, so I'm a little bit, hang on a second here. Let me make sure oh, there we go. Okay, I got to show my screen here.
There you go. There you are. You're up.
Yep.
Well, yeah, you're showing us the present. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there we go.
There it is.
Nice. I'm about as professional as you guys at this. So. All right. So as the screen says, today we're going to talk a little bit about stuff that can go wrong. If you haven't flown for a while, the things that are listed on the screen there, I'm not going to, death by PowerPoint is the worst thing in the world. So I'm not going to just read the screen there. You can read it yourself. But that's the kind of stuff they're going to be dealing with. Now I've got to figure out here how I can get back to PowerPoint so I can change the screens. Thank you very much. There we go. So I've only done this about 6 times on Rusty Pilot, but every time it's kind of, I got to retrain myself. So anyway, I need a flight review on webinars. So what could go wrong? Let's talk a little bit first about aeronautical decision making. That's huge. And you know something, aeronautical decision making begins at home. This is not something that you just kind of get out to the airport, you go like this, where's the wind coming from, and is there any clouds in the sky? This starts at home. It's first of all, you know, with the I'm safe acronym: illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotions. You may not go through each one of those letter by letter, but at some point you're going to be taking a stock of how well you feel, and if you think that you're up to the task of flying an airplane. I tell this story oftentimes in our Rusty Pilot seminars that I was doing some flight instruction a few years ago, and we were staying in the traffic pattern, and 3 or 4 times around the circuit, and I noticed an airplane, the owner of which I knew, sitting there doing what I guess was a run-up. And I don't know, 4th or 5th time maybe around, saw him taxiing back away from the run-up pad. I saw him a few days later and asked him, you know, had he had a problem with a run-up? And he says, no. I said, well, what was the matter? He said, my head just wasn't in it. And I thought, you know, something, that is a real mature way to think about this. You know, he just wasn't feeling it. So rather than push it just because he already had the airplane out and warmed up, he decided to put the airplane away. And I thought that was a really, really wise decision. There's another acronym, you know, aviation has millions of them, but PAVE is another one, pilot, airplane, environment, with a capital V for the V part, and external pressures. You know, those are all things that I think at one point or another we all consider, whether we think of it in those terms or not. We're still kind of, we're kind of considering that. How's the weather? Again, we just don't want to stick our finger up there and see what the wind is doing. That's probably a good idea to either self-brief, at the very least look at the TAFs in the local area if you have one. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF, talk to a weather briefer, or go on ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot or one of the various apps that are available out there and look and see what the weather is going to be. Not forgetting to check TFRs. Those things can pop up sometimes unexpectedly. The FAA, as you may know, is not sometimes real good at disseminating that information when things pop up quickly. Sometimes ForeFlight actually knows about it before the FAA does or before Flight Service does. So looking at TFRs and checking the weather and just taking your own stock of your own readiness to go. Remember, you're strapping yourself into a tin can with an engine bolted onto the front, and you're going to be flying off into the abyss somewhere, and you kind of need to be ready for that task. So those are the kind of the things that you want to consider as far as your aeronautical decision making goes. So looking at this,
yeah. Pat, if I could just interject real quick too. One of the things I wanted to mention too is maybe what is it that is, like, we hear this official briefing thing oftentimes that people ask about. So what's the deal with that? How do we get those, making sure we've got the official briefing for getting weather and TFRs?
Gee, thank you for asking that, Chris. It's like we rehearsed it. So an official weather briefing happens wherever you have to either give your tail number or where you have to log into a website where it requires a unique username and password. That's how you get a weather briefing. You can call 1-800-WXBrief.com, and one of the first things they're going to ask you, if you haven't already registered with Leidos Flight Service, is your tail number. Well, that makes it an official briefing at that point. If you go to aviationweather.gov or 1-800-WXBrief.com, because Flight Service has a website, which is an awesome website for a lot of reasons we don't have time to go into here, or flightplan.com or NavMonster or AOPA's iPlanner. All of those that require usernames and passwords will provide you a briefing. I would caution you this, though, especially if you're about to engage in a long cross country, you might want to call and talk to an actual briefer. If you've ever printed out, I don't know, have you, any of you guys that are on the line here with me, have any of you guys ever printed out a weather briefing for any kind of a cross country of any kind of distance?
Yeah, I used to, yes, before ForeFlight.
Yeah.
It was that thick.
Yeah.
About a half a ream of paper and about 8-point font. And it's really difficult to pick up on some of the nuances of that self-briefing. Based on that, my eyes start to cross when I get through about the second or third page, and then I get to about 700 TAFs and, you know, a whole bunch of NOTAMs and things like that, and trying to find an FDC NOTAM, which is a really important NOTAM because those are regulatory in nature. FDC stands for Flight Data Center, and those are NOTAMs that are regulatory in nature. And it's just like, you know, if you get a ticket for doing something in the car and you say, well, officer, I didn't know it was against the law. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. So if you do something that goes against an FDC NOTAM, and usually it's a change in a crossing altitude or a fix or something like that, Occasionally it can be a change in airspace. For example, there's a Class Delta airport not too far from the airport where I fly out of here in Houston, and for years it was a non-towered field in Class G, and then the owner decided to put a control tower in there, and it went to a towered field in Class G airspace. And you might say, well, can that happen? Yes, it can. It's rare, but it can happen. But when it happens, you have to treat that as a towered field with Class Delta airspace around it, even though it's not depicted. So it's the same rules. You have to talk to the tower before you get within 4 miles of airspace, and so on and so forth. Well, the FTC NOTAM told people about that, and then a year or two later, they were granted Class Delta status, but it was in between chart cycles. And so an FTC NOTAM went up telling people that it was now Class Delta airspace, and so there was no excuse for busting it. So, it's kind of a long-winded way to answer your question, Chris, but calling flight service or doing some sort of self-briefing could save you from some real grief down the road.
Well, yeah, Pat, let me chime in here because I totally agree. I call flight service regularly when I feel the need to get a brief, because those folks, they can somehow parse and, find out the NOTAMs that really mean something. Because, when I'm looking through that list, I use ForeFlight as well. It's kind of daunting, all those things that you have to read through, and they can just give you what really matters. And I think that's really worth the call.
Yeah, I agree. This was several years ago. I had to go up to the Dallas area to do, I think it was a Rusty pilot. And it was that time of year when the weather can be fairly volatile. And I was looking at all of the weather information in ForeFlight and others, and trying to decide whether I should drive or fly. I didn't really want to fly or drive 5.5 hours, 6 hours. So I was looking at ForeFlight, and I finally decided, I'm going to take my own advice. I'm going to call flight service, and I did. And this is not a joke. I talked to the briefer for about 45 minutes. And by the time we were done, I knew the name of his wife and his kids and how old they were and what schools they went into. And that's not a joke either. But we developed a plan. And basically, I flew the plan. I had several options, including turn around and come back home because the seminar was the next morning. But I flew the plan exactly as we had devised it. Came around the back side of the front. All the weather at that point was south of me, and landed at Meacham, where they had some rain, and it was obvious that they had. But had it not been for calling flight service and really getting a good briefing like that, more than likely I would have just opted to stay home or actually drive instead of fly. So flight service is your friend, and you're paying for that service, in a roundabout way.
How many hours do you have, Pat?
It's closing in on 1,000. 10,000.
Yeah, exactly. I knew that, so I pointed out, if somebody with 10,000 hours is willing to call flight service and talk for 45 minutes, it makes, the rest of us who have far less experience, something you should think about. All right,
yeah.
What we got next?
By the way, it's all piston time too. There's no turbine time in there.
So just to verify, we got a couple of questions relating to specific programs such as ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot. Does that count as an official weather check?
Yeah, it does, because if you are able to access a weather briefing through ForeFlight in particular, it's because you registered with ForeFlight and you're actually getting a briefing from Leidos Flight Service. You used to get the briefing that used to come through ForeFlight from DUATS, but that changed a couple of years ago, 3 years ago maybe, and now Leidos Flight Service is the provider of all the information that you get through ForeFlight. I don't know about Garmin Pilot or WingX or FlyQ. I don't know where their source is. But it almost doesn't matter, because everybody's source, essentially the mother church of all the weather information that you're going to get, is aviationweather.gov. It's the NOAA website, the government website. Right. So everybody gets their information from the same place, and then how they parse it out and present it to you is up to however they do it. But the cool thing about, I use ForeFlight personally, but one of the cool things about that is when you can see the prog charts and the surface analysis charts and things like that in the documents. I think it's the documents view. You're looking at the very same thing that the briefers are looking at. So you can have a very intelligent conversation with the briefer when you're both looking at the same map. So it's a pretty cool thing.
And if I could just do one word of caution for our listeners too, is just with aviationweather.gov, which is an amazing website. I recommend it all the time. But if you go into the get information for your briefing, just be aware that there's no TFRs and no NOTAM. So that does not count as the complete briefing. You've got to use another source to get the rest of that information.
Oh, I learned something there, Chris. I didn't know that. I'll be darned. All right. Anything else on that subject?
We're done.
All right. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about other things that can go wrong. You know, if you haven't flown for a while, and we're going to talk a little about really two different scenarios, your own airplane versus a rental airplane. If you haven't flown for a while and you walk out to your airplane, remember, your airplane hasn't flown either. So birds, especially if the airplane's tied down outside, birds could have nested in your cowling. The battery may be dead if you haven't had a trickle charger or some sort of attender to your battery. If your airplane sits outside, particularly if it's not undercover, you might have water contamination in the tanks. That could be a really bad day right there. Are the tires properly inflated, especially if you're living in an area where you have extreme hot and extreme cold, where the constant expansion and compression of the air? Check your tires. Make sure that they haven't set up and gotten kind of flat on the bottom side. You know, well, I got a flat tire. Well, it's only flat on the bottom. That doesn't matter. But you know, just make sure that it hasn't set up and you end up with a flat spot on your tire. Check for dry rot. You know, you may laugh about that, but again, if an airplane sits for a long period of time and that rubber is not being exercised, a dry rot can be an issue, not just on your tires, but on the hoses and tubing and things like that in the engine as well. So check your brakes for proper fluid, possible corrosion on the rotors, which ultimately isn't going to be very good for you. Look in your pitot tube and any other areas where wasps or birds or something could have taken root. I shared a video with my colleagues here yesterday after a conversation we had about an incident that I had with the Citabria, where a mud dauber had built a nest inside of a fuel line, and I didn't know it, and took off and flew and basically ran out of gas. Now, I want to make a point of saying that this was fuel starvation, not fuel exhaustion. Two different things. But the result essentially was the same. We ended up with an unexpected stop in a field and a quick check of the gas tank that was empty, put some more gas in it and took back off out of that same field. But it could have ended up being a really, really bad day on that. So making sure that that your fuel lines are in good shape to the extent that you can is a good thing. Are your struts properly inflated? And of course, this is particularly on Piper products, where you've got landing gear struts under the wings, and certainly Cessna products where you've got the main gear strut, or any other airplane for that matter, where you have some sort of inflatable strut. You know.
So Pat, do we have a shortcut for this? I mean, how can we make sure that we get everything that we're supposed to check?
Funny you should ask that, Keith, because I was just about to say a checklist.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. You'd think we rehearsed it, like I said. No, your checklist is really the go-to thing. I'm pointing out, you know, these are things that you should pay a particular attention to, and not just kind of maybe the cursory type of walk around that oftentimes we fall into. And when we get into that kind of complacency mode, we've flown the airplane 100 hours in the last month or two, and we know it inside and out. But in this case, the thing is set for a while. So paying real good attention to that checklist in excruciating detail is really, really a good thing. If you're a renter and you haven't flown for a while, or perhaps you're a frequent customer of a flight school and you know that they've been shut down because of all of this corona business, it might not be a bad idea not only to use a checklist really thoroughly as you're doing the walk around, but before, you might want to ask to see the logbooks and make sure that the annual has been done. And if 100 hours required, has that been done? Has the pedostatic been done? Has the altimeter been done? Has the ADSB upgrade been done if you're flying in airspace that requires ADSB? All of those are things that need to be a part of your pre-flight. And I think it's 91.3 that says that we as pilots are responsible for the airworthiness of the airplane. And I think it's 91.3 that says that. So, who's responsible for the airworthiness? Well, we are. So if you're flying a rental airplane, you want to take a special emphasis and look at the things I've shown on the screen here: the airframe, engine prop, and avionics log. Make sure that the databases are updated. Those kind of things. So.
And one thing I wanted to ask Pat, just because I know you're an experienced aircraft owner, with engines that have been sitting for a while, if people haven't been flying them, is there anything in particular that just an operational that you think about, or?
Well, we're going to get into some of that as we
Okay.
move forward. But in fact, let me go ahead and put this next slide up, and I think that's going to get kind of to the heart of your question, Chris. So engine start.
Well, and I will point out that the not next week, but the week after, we're going to have a program focused specifically on aircraft. So we will go over this, quickly and make sure we cover everything. But we will dive deeply into this coming up pretty soon.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pat.
So without getting too granular here, obviously a part of your pre-flight is do you have enough oil in the engine? If that airplane is sat more than 3 months or so, you probably want to have an oil change done. And I think an A&P could confirm or deny that. But I think conventional wisdom, if the airplane hasn't run for 3 months or more, you really want to have an oil change before you fire it up. So that might be something to think about. But I put a checklist here, and you're going to see that's a recurring theme throughout the throughout this next 45 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever we've got. It's checklist. It's really easy for our muscle memory to get stale, and things that seemed very, very natural to you 3 months ago or 2 months ago, or in some cases over a year ago for some of our visitors today. That muscle memory can fail us, and we like to think that we're invincible and we'll remember, but the fact is that we don't. I'm fortunate enough to have a partnership in a Comanche, which was on that first page, that pretty 1969 Comanche there. But I'm also fortunate to have a partnership in a Cirrus, and I know if I haven't flown either one of those airplanes in even a week, and I get into them, it takes me a second to get my mind into that particular cockpit. And because of the fact that I'm a DPE and I fly, I don't know how many different types of airplanes I have been in over the last several years, and as a flight instructor, how many. It takes a few minutes to kind of get focused in on, okay, this one has a Garmin 650. Okay, wait a second, let me think about how that works. And that one has a Garmin 430. Well, the architecture is similar, but the buttonology is different. So that's all muscle memory stuff, and it can get rusty very quickly. So always use that checklist for engine startup. I couldn't find a really good taxiing diagram, so I just picked a taxi. I thought that was. But there's that 5-cylinder engine up there. So use your checklists. Here's something you may think is funny, but before you go to start the engine, make sure you've taken the tow bar off the nose gear. I've got a friend, honestly, who had to get an engine rebuild and a brand new prop because he forgot to take the tow bar off the nose gear as he was pulling it out. He got distracted, started the engine, and noticed the tow bar go, flying that way, and wondered what that strange clunking noise was. So that wasn't a very good thing for him. Again, making sure that the radios and all your electronic stuff is updated. Especially if you're flying the airplane under IFR, in IFR, obviously you want to make sure you're current and proficient to do that. But beyond that, there's databases that have to be updated usually every 28 days or thereabouts. So If you're flying in a place where terrain can change, or where waypoints and things like that are known to change frequently, make sure your database is updated is important. During the mag check, or during the run-up, make sure that you check the mags especially closely. Again, this airplane has sat for perhaps a month or 2 or 3 or more. Make sure the carb heat's working properly. Make sure your oil has come up to temperature and the pressure is right.
So Pat, in your experience, having done many flight reviews and this sort of thing, people who haven't been flying for a while, what type of things is it that they tend to not be good at? Is it these procedural type things, or is it muscle memory, the actual physical part of flying, or what do you think?
Well, it's a lot of things. I was going to kind of summarize that a little bit towards the tail end here, but there are the things that I noticed that go stale pretty quickly are, believe it or not, just simply holding a constant airspeed, particularly when you're landing. Holding the center line when you're taxiing, holding the center line when you take off and land. These are little things, but I'll just tell you a quick story. I had a designated examiner when I got my initial flight instructor rating. Actually, my first flight instructor rating was in a glider, but my second flight instructor rating was for airplanes. And I had an examiner who was kind of an irascible old son of a gun, and he liked to try to intimidate people. But the scenario towards the tail end of the check ride was this: I'm a flight instructor, and the examiner was a student that was getting ready to be signed off for his check ride, and I was supposed to critique the DPE, who was pretending to be a student, do S-turns across the road. So we went up and we came around, we did this one, and then we did this one, and he said, okay, how did I do? And I said, well, you did all right on the first one. You didn't lose any altitude, and therefore your airspeed stayed pretty stable, and you didn't bank too steeply, and so on and so forth. And you came around the other side, and your bank was good, and everything. In other words, basically same critique, and you rolled out just fine. He says no, and he slammed the dashboard of the instrument panel on the airplane. He said no. He said I was 3 degrees off on that last rollout. And then he looked at me, and this is one thing I'll never forget. He said, it's the little things. And what he was trying to tell me is to be on the lookout for normalization of deviation. So if 3 degrees is okay today, is 4 degrees okay tomorrow? And this applies to anything that you want to talk about. If 50 feet is okay today, is 75 feet okay tomorrow? And so when I talk about things like holding the center line, I'm talking about, this is consistency type stuff. We'll never be perfect pilots. We cannot attain perfection. We can attain consistency. We can attain consistency. That means taxiing on the damn center line. It means keeping the angle of the runway, at basically the same angle relative to the airplane, particularly in a non-towered field. You can control that. Don't fly a mile wide downwind today and a half a mile wide downwind tomorrow. Bad form. You can't repeat something that you're not willing to try to be consistent with. So it's probably not a good way to say it, but you get the idea. So consistency these are things that we can achieve, and oftentimes if you haven't flown for a while, that is difficult to get back. Your crosswind technique, I notice that a lot if somebody hasn't flown in a crosswind very much. Their crosswind technique goes to pot very, very quickly. Rudder skills, huge one. Either too much or not enough, but rarely is it like Goldilocks and 3 bears? Is it just right? It's always either too much or not enough with people that haven't flown for a while. People don't realize that when you're making a climbing left-hand turn, for example, you don't need the aileron to help you. Just back off the right rudder a little bit. The airplane will turn left. And what do? They mash on the left rudder and the ball slides way out there, and so does your butt on the seat. So it's little things like that, rounding out too high or too low when you're landing. If you're out of practice landing, you're going to have a tendency to round out too high or too low. Either one can end up being a bad day for the airplane and a kind of an embarrassing day for you. Landing too fast is another one that comes to mind. Again, and that goes back to airspeed control. So landing too fast, what can that do? Well, tell me. We have 3 CFIs sitting on this call, 2 CFIs sitting on this call. What can landing at a too fast an airspeed do to you?
It gets you back to the hangar faster.
Exactly what
Was that not right?
I like to use it so I can land on the last third of the runway because I floated all the way down.
Yeah, exactly. And
You don't have to tag far, gosh.
It can create an interesting effect too with all the smoke coming off the tires as you're screeching to a halt. And eventually that goes down to the metal on the wheels, and now you have sparks. So it creates quite a show for the people that are watching you do that. Not to mention the and eventually the landing gear collapse. That will
I was even thinking the ballooning during the trying to hold your flare, just ballooning like crazy with all that speed too. My goodness.
I've got a good friend.
That's a great YouTube video.
I got a good friend. I just tell you this real quick. I've got a good friend. I was talking to over dinner last night, and he does have a tendency to land too fast, but he's able to pretty much take care of his entire landing proficiency requirement on approach. So there's that.
So I'm really curious what the next slide is here.
Oh, let me get there. Let's see, kind of shoot and ask. Okay. So again, if we're talking about various phases of flight, hold that center line. We talked a little bit about that just a couple of minutes ago. Hold that center line. It really should be a point of pride to us as pilots that we can taxi on the center line. It really should be. And what about emergencies? Now, again, you haven't flown in a month or 2 or 3 or 6 or 9 or whatever the number might be. What are you going to do in the event of an emergency? And this should be something that every pilot, rusty or not, goes through before they advance the go fast lever, and think about, well, what happens if the engine starts to cough on me here on the takeoff roll? Well, if I'm still on the ground, I'm going to throttle back and try to bring the airplane to a halt, one way or the other, whether it's overrun the end of the runway or off on the side or something, but try to bring the airplane to a stop. What if we've rotated? Well, it kind of a little bit depends on how high you are when this thing happens, and how long it takes you to really realize that it is happening, because there is a moment of disbelief when these things happen. It really is. I can tell you that from my own experiences, that there's about a 5-second period that you just want to say, well, first of all, there's a particular word that comes to mind that I can't say in mixed company, but after you said that word, then it's like, this isn't really happening to me. And then you realize, oh, it is. And so now we've got to do something. But anyway, depending on how high you are, then your only choice may simply be to land straight ahead, no matter what's there, or make some very shallow turns to try to avoid whatever's there. But in the case of my airport at West Houston, if you're taking off to the south, you've got nothing but trees for about a mile. And so, climbing at best rate or almost best angle for a while to get some altitude is oftentimes not a bad idea. If you are at a sufficient altitude, can you make it back to the airport? And I would suggest to you, if you've never practiced the impossible turn, which is of course the turn back to the airport, I would suggest that you get with an instructor who's not scared to go up to a safe altitude using maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet AGL as a hard deck, and see how much altitude you will lose in not just a 180-degree turn, but make it a 270-degree turn, which will more accurately reflect the potential altitude loss on a turn back to the airport. Because remember, not only are you turning back, but you also got to line up with the runway. So get an instructor that's willing to go up there and work with you and see how much altitude you're going to lose. In some airplanes, I can make 180, 270-degree turn. In some airplanes, as little as 400 feet. But in some, it's going to take 800 or 900. So if you know what that's going to take in your airplane, and you can double it because you're not practicing it all the time, double that, and there's your minimum altitude before you even think about returning to the airport. I'm not advocating the impossible turn. There are some people that think it's the most dangerous thing that you can do. I don't happen to agree with that, but there are some people that do, and that's okay. But I think that it's a tool that you can have in your toolbox in the event that you really need it. At least it should be something that you've got in your toolbox. So
Yeah,
emergencies are something to think about.
And I see that I practice the impossible turn as well, and it's much more possible than what we won't get deep into it, but it's much more possible than what people used to talk about a few years ago. And Pablo, it looks like you put in the chat section about the impossible turn. Pablo, let me ask you, how many questions are coming in here? Should we keep talking, or are we going to have to veer off the questions pretty soon?
We actually don't have that many questions. I was just going to ask one now, and then I think there's only 4 after that. So. What I was going to ask is about the center line. Someone's asking if correcting any drift very close to the runway, is it best to use a rudder in lieu of aileron?
Well, as with most things in aviation, oftentimes there is not a either or black and white answer. It's kind of like, do you control your speed with pitch, or do you control your speed with power? And the answer is it kind of depends on what regime or what realm of flight you're in as to which one of those might, or a combination thereof, might be the best. So, the best thing that I can say to you is that if you're taking off in a crosswind, and I would go so far as to say no matter how strong or weak it might be, start off with full aileron against the wind, and then whatever amount of rudder it takes to keep you on the center line. But as you accelerate down the runway, obviously we have more airflow over the control surfaces, making them much more effective. So, you might start like this, but as you accelerate, you're constantly moving the yoke back to the center position or neutral. And it should be about the time that you're ready to rotate. So that way you're not dropping a wing when you take off. So it's going to be a combination of both, but less aileron the faster you go. As far as landing, there's two typical techniques that are taught in landing. One is a slip all the way down, and then just straighten out and land. In other words, kick out the slip and land. And then the other way is just crab all the way down, and at the very end, kick that nose around and lower the wing.
So let's say that you're in the flare, okay? So you're 5 to 10 feet above the runway, and you've drifted off the center line. I mean, personally, I would lower the wing, against the way I'm drifting, and it's only like 6 inches to a foot at most. I mean, just a little correction. I mean, is that what do you do in those last few moments, Pat?
Whatever it takes.
Yeah.
And I know that might sound like a kind of a smart aleck answer, and I really don't mean it to be, but at some point I'm not really aware of the corrections I'm putting in.
But are you using the rudder, or are you using the aileron right there at the last little bit?
If you have to use the aileron to bring it over, and it brings the nose around the same direction that the aileron is, you're going to have to use some rudder to counteract it. So it depends, and that's why I said whatever it takes. There's that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, or there's always more than one thing in place. So you can lower the wing some, but if it causes you to become misaligned with the center line, you got to use the rudder to get it back over. So it isn't either or, it ends up being both, but maybe one first and then the other.
And the one thing maybe to throw in there too, 2 quick things is, one is, don't forget, if you need to, you can always go around. If it's getting that hairy, get out of there, don't continue. And the other thing is, for practicing both the takeoff and the landing, I find that I'm very much a promoter of this idea of doing low approaches over the runway and working with an instructor, and that will help you learn those control inputs, especially when there's wind, so you can work with that and you'll get a better feel. So if you feel like you're not proficient, I found it's a great way to get proficient again and to get your view again for what the flare height should be.
Yeah, that's actually that's a really good technique too. If you're landing in a wind that you're just not sure that you can handle, if you fly across the runway and put that slip in, 30 or 40 feet above the runway, if you find that you're able to hold kind of the imaginary center line and not be blown off the runway, then likely that you've got enough rudder to be able to handle that challenge and get back down on the ground. So, that, and there are other crosswind techniques that you can use. If you want to, if you've got a really, really wide runway, you can actually kind of angle across the runway a little bit, or you can land on the upwind edge of the runway. If you really think you're not going to have enough rudder and aileron combination to keep on the runway, you can always land on the upwind edge of the runway, allowing the airplane to drift a little bit across the center line, perhaps, and to the other side. So there would be an exception to the rule of landing on the center line.
Right.
All these rules that we talk about, or all these best practices that we talk about, oftentimes there are some exceptions to those. It's not black and white. So, watching your gauges, using your checklist as you transition from climb to cruise, double checking your checklist. I put an engine in quadrant down there at the very bottom of the slide. I think that was from a B-17. Lots of things to watch. but a checklist is, again, it's just a recurring theme. As we're up in cruise, what are we going to do? Well, we got to watch for traffic. Take a look at the image there on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's from Oshkosh. I've got a similar image on my iPad from Sun and Fun from a couple of years ago. So watching for traffic is huge, and traffic is on this screen for two reasons. It's because it's really important. If you're up there, especially if you're just by yourself, if you've gone off to knock a little rust out, do some refresher maneuvers. Remember all those basic maneuvers that you swore you'd never do again after you got your private pilot certificate, or even your commercial pilot certificate. So go up and do an S-turn across the road. Do some stalls. If you got your commercial certificate, do a lazy 8 or a chandelle or something like that, and kind of get the feel for the rudder, get a feel for what the wind is doing to you, because that's what S-turns and turns about a point are perfect for those types of things, figuring out what the wind is doing to you, which translates into flying a traffic pattern in a way that enables you to fly a true parallel leg on the downwind and not just be drifting off the, wider and wider from the runway, or closer and closer, as the case may be. Neither one of those things are very good. So that's some things that you can do when you're airborne, just to kind of knock some of the rust off there. Return. There's the professional part of me right there. Returning to the airport, landing and taxiing to parking. Well, checklists again. There's that checklist, same old checklist. Do we need carb heat? Do we remember to push the mixture in and enrich in that? Do we remember in a low-wing airplane in particular to turn to the fullest tank? All of those things are going to be on your checklist. Making proper radio calls. And one of my pet peeves to rant about is the one that's any traffic in the area, please advise. If you look at AIM 4.1.9, and yes, there it addresses in AIM 4.1.9, it actually says that any traffic in the area, please advise, is not a good radio call. In fact, should never be used under any circumstances. But you hear it all the time. And in fact, I was flying out of a small non-tower field several years ago. Chris, I think you've probably heard this story. And there was a Phenom coming into land as a beautiful day. And I had a student in the airplane with me. Phenom coming into land, and it was Brenham traffic. Phenom 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're 10 miles north inbound of the RNAV 16 Brenham. Any traffic in the area, known or unknown, please advise. Absolutely true. And I so wanted to key the mic, but I am a professional, so I didn't. But anyway, so that proper radio phraseology, and you can kind of get a primer on that, or a reminder if you want, by clicking by going to Say It Right, which is on the ASI, the Air Safety Institute website. It's free of charge. It's a great refresher on radio phraseology and things like that. If you have kind of forgotten about traffic pattern etiquette, you can look at circular 90.66b that's shown on the bottom of the screen there. If you're an insomniac, this will take care of that, I promise you. But it's a really good circular, and it was updated in 2018 after, I think, something like 25 years. I don't remember exactly, but it was something like 25 years since the last time it was updated. And it talks about the idea of right-of-ways and things like that, much of which is already covered in the AIM. Traffic patterns at a non-towered field. If you look at AIM, if you look at the advisory circular, if you look at the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 7 of the Airplane Flying Handbook, all addresses traffic pattern work. And so entering a traffic pattern on the downwind leg, most of us remember 45 degrees of the downwind leg. But what if you're on the other side of the airport, having to get across the airport and then enter the traffic pattern on the downwind leg? The Airplane Flying Handbook recommends you fly over the top of the airport 500 feet above traffic pattern altitude, fly 2 miles beyond where the downwind leg would be flown, and then descend to traffic pattern altitude, and then make a 180-degree turn back and ultimately end up at a 45 into the downwind. I hate that. And I'll tell you the reason. More often than not, people that use that traffic pattern entry will indeed fly across the top of the traffic pattern at 500 feet. But immediately over the top of the runway, or almost over the top of the runway, they'll start a descending turn. And in this case, it would be a right-hand turn into the left traffic pattern. But they'll start a descending turn, which puts them directly in opposition to the downwind leg. And as they continue coming around, it puts them in direct opposition to the crosswind leg. The most dangerous way to enter the traffic pattern is that teardrop entry to the downwind leg if it's done incorrectly. And so if you're going to do that, make sure that you fly out beyond the airport for about a mile or so, because oftentimes somewhere between half a mile and a mile is about where a common downwind leg is flown. And then fly another 2 miles or more. And for me, I fly more than that, beyond that downwind leg before I descend to traffic pattern altitude and then start my turn back in. That way you've got plenty of time to be able to judge the flow of traffic, lots of time to listen for any other traffic that might be there. In the meantime, not only are you listening for what they're telling you, but you're giving good, accurate, concise traffic pattern or location reports yourself. And you don't have to say I'm 3.2 miles from the airport. Nobody can tell if you're 3 miles or 3.2 miles from the airport. Approximately 3 miles is close enough, or approximately 5 miles is close enough. You know, I'm 3.1412 away from the airport. I'm at pi, basically. That tells nobody anything. So yeah, Chris got that. The school teacher got that one.
Yes.
All right, so hey, Pat, someone's asking before takeoff and entering the runway at an untowered airport, is it okay to ask if anyone's on final at that point?
You know, if somebody's on final and they're not talking, it's because they probably don't have a radio. So point your airplane towards the final approach and look and announce that you're just about ready to depart runway, let's say runway 15. You're not taking the active, because I'm going to say, where are you taking it? When are you going to bring it back? I'm going to need it in a few minutes. So you're not taking the active. You are departing runway 15. And here's the reason that's important. If you're at a non-towered field that has more than one runway, and there are some that have runways that may be crossed or what have you, and especially here in Texas, there are several airports that, depending on where the wind's coming from, either runway can be active because it's an equal crosswind component. So if you just say taking the active, you've told nobody that's approaching the airport what runway is being used. If you say that you're clear of the active, you've told nobody anything. So I'm departing runway 15. I would personally, I always check and make sure that there's nobody coming in on final approach. I'm listening as I'm doing the run up to see if anybody has reported a 10-mile final, which they do, or that somebody's in the traffic pattern doing takeoffs and landings. But I look, I listen, and before I taxi out on the runway, I'll typically say something like, West Houston traffic, Comanche 31 Whiskey Hotel is taxiing onto runway 15 for immediate departure. And if there's somebody on the downwind leg, or excuse me, on final approach, that's oftentimes enough to make them chime in. There's no perfect solution here, and you're not going to get a ticket from the FAA from saying, is there anybody on final? But if nobody answers, you don't really know anything. If 3 or 4 or 5 people answer at one time, it could be just a whole bunch of of Good Samaritans who chime in and say, nope, nobody's on final that I know of. So what do you know? You really don't know anything. So the best defense is a good offense, and that's simply announce what your intentions are. Wait a second to make sure that somebody doesn't come in and say, wait a minute, I'm here, and then go out. But ultimately, you have to use your best judgment and do what you think is right. And at the end of the day, we just don't want to bend metal. I mean, that's really at the end of the day, we don't want to bend metal. So that's kind of my rant on communications and traffic patterns.
Yeah, we like rants.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Here, go ahead. Somebody said.
No, go ahead.
That's all you got?
Well, I've got more questions that'll cover more, not related to the you're on right now. So when we get there, we'll answer those. Okay, cool. So what else go wrong? Shutdown and securing your airplane. Once again, there is our checklist. Surprise, surprise, surprise. As we're taxiing in and we shut down the airplane, obviously, let's make sure that all the systems are off. And an old grizzled flight instructor many years ago told me that SLIM is a good shutdown checklist. And what does that stand for? Switches, lean, ignition, master. Switches, lean, ignition, master. And what a cool thing, because it covers literally everything that you have to do. Now, I'm not saying don't use the checklist at all. Quite the contrary. If you choose to use SLIM, great, but pick up the checklist and make sure that you have, in fact, turned off everything that you're supposed to do. But switches would include everything but the master. That's not included. That's not considered a switch for the purpose of this acronym. Switches, lean, ignition, master. I just think that's a really, really cool way to remember that. So
that is good. I'm seeing a question here I want to get answered. It says, it's been a few years since the last flight review. What is the best approach to getting back to flying? It said, obviously you need some flight instruction, but should CFIs approach this differently from a new student pilot? Since we've got 30% of people who on the webinar here who haven't flown in the past year, what do we think about that?
Are you talking about a CFI that hasn't flown in the last year, or just a
no? Should a CFI, so somebody who hasn't flown in a long time, you're a CFI, okay, and somebody hasn't flown in a long while, do you approach them differently than a new student?
Than a new student?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, for anybody that comes to me for a flight review, because I still do instruction on the side. I love doing that. Anybody that comes to me like that, first of all, I'm going to give them about 6 ASI online video learning programs to go through. Say it right. Know before you go is a really good one as an aerospace refresher. So say it right for radio stuff. Know before you go. We have several IMC or VMC into IMC, visual conditions into instrument condition related things. We've got some stuff on, especially if you're getting a little bit long in the tooth or getting a little older. We've got a really good webinar on older pilots and flying healthy into your senior years. But I'll pick 4, 5, 6 of those and send it to the person in advance. And I ask them to print out the wings credit certificate at the end, because I want to know that they've done it. And as soon as they've done that, then I know, okay, well, we can kind of pick and choose what we talk about in the oral, and oftentimes it will shorten the oral a little bit, because as you know, we're supposed to do at least an hour. But if they'll do that, oftentimes it will shorten that oral. It'll be at least an hour that we're talking, but it will shorten it up from maybe 3 or 4 hours or 2 hours to an hour and a half or something.
So I'm going to jump in right here, because this is our typical time where we tell people the official webinar is over, but we're going to stay here and answering questions as long as anybody wants to be asking questions. And there was a couple people who joined late, and they were asking about recordings. And so I will say again, because I know not everybody gets on right when the webinar starts, is that everybody who registered for the webinar, whether you attended or not, you're going to get a link in about 6 hours or so to the recording, so that you'll be able to watch it, as you get the opportunity. And also, once again, you are eligible for wings credit for this webinar. And so that will be an automatic process. As soon as we get all the data, we're going to upload it to the FAA site, and they'll do the reconciliation and make sure that you get your wings credit. So you shouldn't have to do anything to be able to get that credit. So right now, I will ask Pablo, are there any questions that are outstanding that you think
Yes,
that
sir.
we should jump into?
Absolutely. All right, so CFIs, AOPA, perfect question. Anyone teaching the racetrack pattern with rounded base turns that was proposed by research done by UND and AOPA?
Yeah, when I was in the Navy, but no, not otherwise.
No.
We did do racetrack patterns, and I liked them, but it's just not what we do here.
Yeah, I actually do teach a modified version of that. So I do the squared stuff for the turn from downwind to base. But I know I saw a question in there too as I was kind of skimming through, and somebody was asking about. They said they were doing the flight review, and the bank, the person was being told, don't do bank too much in the pattern because we don't want to get in trouble with a stall. But then it makes it difficult sometimes when you're trying to roll out on final. And so one of the things that I've ended up doing, and that I find works really well, is that I will square my turn from downwind to base, but then that base to final turn, rather than trying to time it at an exact 90 degrees on the final, it's really easy to overshoot. So what I do is I start to do more of a gradual turn in. So imagine sort of cutting that corner off. And what I find that does is it allows me to start judging a whole lot faster. If I'm a little like I'm too far on the one side, like on my side of the runway, then I'll ease the bank out. But then if I can see like, oh, I've got to turn a little steeper, and it makes it a lot easier to judge that turn to final. So I kind of do a modified version of that. And I know that the Air Safety Institute is doing that study. I don't know if they've come out with the results of it or not yet, but I've kind of adopted that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I have mixed feelings about that. As with so many things, I have mixed feelings about that. If you're flying a low wing airplane and you're doing that type of an approach, you can obscure people coming in on a straight in. Shouldn't be doing it on a non-towered field, but nonetheless they do, as you all know. If you're flying a high wing airplane, that type of turn can often obscure the runway from your sight. So that turn, I'm only surmising this, but I think that turn probably was popular or is popularized because in so many of these military airplanes where you're sitting way out in front of the wing, you've got a really good view of the entire traffic pattern. But in our type of airplanes where raising a wing could obscure the final approach or lowering the wing could obscure the runway, I think that we have to be careful how we teach that. Not saying not to, I'm just thinking we have to be careful just by making a blanket statement that that's a better way to do it.
Well, what I tell my students as well is you get 30 degrees angle of bank, and so if you're turning from base to final, you go take it to 30 if you don't think you're going to make it. If you're going to do a big overshoot there, it's time to go around.
I teach a 30-degree bank angle from downwind to base. It's a comfortable angle. It's nowhere near getting close enough to a critical angle of attack that's going to create an issue as long as you control your airspeed properly. That's not an issue. 30 degrees gets you around from on that 90-degree turn quickly, so the wind has less time to do bad things to you. Mm-hmm. And then really for the same reason on the base to the final turn, 30 degrees is plenty. And I see what you're saying, Chris. I think that there's a lot of merit to that kind of gradual kind of here we go kind of an approach. I do think there's merit to that, but as almost as with the with that teardrop entry to the downwind leg thing that we talked a few minutes ago, if it isn't taught properly and if it's not executed properly, I think it's not great.
And just to clarify, I know what you guys are saying because I was part of the initial experimentation with that full turn from sort of a beam, the turn all the way, and that took a lot of practice for me to even get the idea of how to do it. And there's a lot of judgment involved. And like I said, what I'm doing is I still do that hard turn from base to final. So I'm looking for the 45-degree angle, turn on base, but it's just that turn to final. I just started earlier rather than trying to knock it off right at 90. And so I don't see, or I have not experienced, and admittedly I'm doing it in 172s all the time. I've never had any trouble with that visibility part, but I find it's easier to then ease onto final rather than trying to time it at an exact 90 degrees. And then it's like often I'm seeing students overshoot then.
Yeah.
Okay, Pat, could I have you run? Let's
say,
run to the next slide, and so that we forgot to announce next week, so everybody, because people are starting to jump off here. A lot of people jump off at the hour point. So next week, June 3rd at, is that right? Yeah, June 3rd at noon Eastern. Our subject is contact ASI's return to flight proficiency plan. So we were talking today about the things that could go wrong. Next week, we're going to have the plan for how you can go about addressing the things that would go wrong. Now, if you are registered for this webinar, you are automatically registered for next week as well. Like I said before at the beginning, if you can't make it to next week's webinar, do nothing. You don't have to show up, and you will receive after the webinar is over a link to the recording so that you can watch it then. Okay, Pablo, do we have any more questions?
Oh yeah, they're coming in fast and furious now. So I didn't. It's been they're coming quick. So all right, here we go. I promise this will be the next one. On the subject of checklist, I see videos of pilots that have the word craft on their iPads while listening to ATIS.
Oh, yeah.
What is this acronym, and is it a good thing to incorporate?
All right. So
Chris, I know you like that. You want to take it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's like I know we've talked about this one before, and so I would say I do like that one. And for me, the big thing was it gives you the order in which you're going to get instruction from ATC. It always comes in that order, and it makes it a little easier. So it just depends. It's like I know I think about that. I don't use it for every ATC clearance, but definitely if you're like at a Charlie or a Bravo and departing out, they're going to give you a VFR clearance out or maybe a Tersa as well. So I do like that in the sense of.
What was the question?
Oh,
The
clearance.
C is clearance.
Yep. Clearance limit, so you're cleared to, like maybe when you're getting taxi instructions, cleared to runway 23, then your route. So for example, for taxi, it's going to give you all the taxi ways that you're going to go. If you're flying, like for an IFR clearance, but even for a VFR departure clearance, altitude, the F is for frequency, and then the T is for
transponder code.
Thank you. Yeah, the transponder code, which normally you're not going to do too much of that VFR, unless again you're departing out VFR from a Charlie, a Tersa, or a Bravo.
All right, and then Keith, here's clarification. You said June 3rd. It's June 4th. And that's thank you to Edmund on that one.
Yes.
Okay, well, you're right. I stink. You know, that didn't seem right. Anyway, it's next Thursday. We're Thursdays at noon Eastern.
Okay, so here's another one. And this is, it hurts me to read this first part of it, but excellent presentation from everyone, solid suggestions. Any follow-up reading material that Pat has? Oh.
Any follow-up reading material?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'll tell you honestly, that's a pretty good book. It really is, especially the AIM portion. It's a really good book. You know, we have so much good content on the ASI side of things. I can't speak highly enough for the videographers and the entire staff at ASI. They do just a superb job of putting out good training videos. It's all, which is excellent content. I'd recommend the Airplane Flying Handbook. Lots of pretty pictures and diagrams and things like that in there. If you don't like to read, there's lots of pretty pictures, diagrams in there. That's a good book. If you're getting back into instrument currency, there's the Instrument Flying Handbook. That's another one, or the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. All those are FAA publications. You can download that stuff for free, or you can buy them from a commercially available source, which is what I did. So I've got the book right there in front of me. But those would be a few.
An interesting thing about that, I mean, you know, I started flying when I was 16, just like you did, and it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this. If you keep reading those books periodically, you keep finding new things in them because you have enhanced understanding. So, you know, they're kind of evergreen in the amount of information and help that they can give you, in my experience.
And just to that, I just posted the link to the Air Safety Institute's main webpage. If you just scroll down a bit, there's safety content by topic. It's awesome, and it has all their stuff. You can find all the information, and it's organized by topic.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Cool. So, sorry, that was a funny one. All right, how about Now this one's interesting because I have never heard anyone say this, but I'm going to read it here so you guys can react or respond. How about, quote, taking off on runway XX rather than departing? I was taught that departing alerted people that you had lost control and were somewhere in the grass, mud, sagebrush. It's not clear whether I'm airborne or in the weeds somewhere.
Okay, so one of the local DPEs that I know very well actually prefers the term taking off. So tomato, tomato in my
But have you guys ever heard of departing meaning that you're off the runway? I mean, off the runway is off the runway.
Oftentimes you'll hear something, you know, he departed normal flight, which kind of is a precursor to like something bad really happened after that. So I can understand that. I can certainly understand that.
Probably the appropriate call there might be like, help, I'm off the runway. Like
yeah, I'm off the runway and I can't get up or something. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, taking off's fine.
Is there such a requirement that requires you to do towered flights in a biannual flight review? If not, what would the CFI's take be for the rusty pilot to get back to flying?
There is no requirement for a towered flight in a flight review. In fact, the flight review requirements are actually quite loosey-goosey. It says 1 hour of ground and 1 hour in the air. And beyond that, I mean, there's a few specifics in there, but for the most part, is whatever you and your CFI agree needs to be done. If I were somebody coming back and hadn't flown for several months, I would take charge of that process and say, look, these are the things I feel like I need to work on. We can certainly do whatever you want to do, Mr. CFI, but I want to work on this, this, and this.
Right.
I'll tell you, from a standpoint of a CFI, if I ask that question of somebody, in fact, I always do, what do you want to work on? And if they say, well, I don't know, I said, well, trust me, I have some things, you know, but I would rather they drive the process.
Right.
Hey, so Pat, there's three people actually have asked about that picture of the Cessna with the drooping wings. What's the deal with that?
I just found it on the internet. It was just kind of a way to illustrate that that's probably tying it down too tightly.
All right, good. Bob Law?
Yeah. All right. So standard rate turn work for base to final, question mark?
Standard rate turn is typically about 15 degrees. The answer is yes, it will. But the problem with that is that it allows the wind to do more stuff to you. You know, if you have, let's say you're landing into a really strong wind right down the runway, well, that means you've got a really strong tailwind on the downwind leg. And if you're flying a standard rate turn, which you certainly can do, there's nothing wrong with it, but you're probably going to have to fly a much wider downwind than necessary because it's going to take you longer to get around to the 90 degrees. And the wind is going to have an opportunity to blow on you that much longer, which is blowing you that much farther away from the base leg. And for me, from the threshold of the runway. And for me, it kind of goes against my desire not to be so far away from the runway that I can't make it in the event of an engine failure. So if you're flying so far away that a 15-degree bank angle puts you 1.5 miles away from the runway, you're likely not going to be able to make it to the runway if you have to. Any guys, you got anything you want to add to that?
No, that sounds about right. I mean, I typically turning from upwind to downwind, like put in a 20-degree angle of bank and just hold that, you know, kind of, I do kind of a racetrack there, and that puts me pretty close to where I want to be on downwind. And so it's going to be something close to that when you're turning from downwind to final.
And I'd say it ends up being the same for me. I'm just thinking of that upwind turn. I'm keeping it tight because I want to be able to glide. And in fact, one of the great things you can practice is actually pulling the engine, just the throttle back and gliding in from a beam just to get used to that and knowing how far you can glide. But that same turn, I do that turn to upwind. I literally turn upwind, roll wings level, check downwind, and just turn right on the downwind. I don't fly a long leg there because I want to keep it tight for the same reason.
Yeah, I teach my students the same thing. If you're turning crosswind, lower that wing, especially if you're in a low wing airplane, lower that wing, take a quick look off the right side and make sure that nobody's coming, then start your turn again, just for the same reason.
And just to verify, we had someone just ask, is it correct that if you register for today's webinar, you're automatically registered for the following ones?
Yes, you are. That's a great question. Great question. So
There you go.
we're gonna be, we have like 7 webinars left this year, and you are registered for all of them.
That's right. Okay, is it okay to practice to extend the downwind a little so there's more distance for any corrections after turning to final?
Oh.
I think we have a consensus here that that's probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
Because again, think again, you know, what happens if you lose your engine? Look, statistically, the chances are minuscule that that's going to happen. But you are flying a piece of machinery and things can break. And why would you want to put yourself in a position of not being able to make the runway? It just it seems to me that's poor aeronautical decision making.
Well, you know, even more frequently, you've got people behind you. You know, I mean, if you've got many people in the pattern at all, and you start extending, then the next guy's going to extend, and pretty soon you got somebody on a 3-minute final, and that's just ridiculous. It should be somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute. You know, it's not very long, as we saw in the video that we did last week. When you turn where you're supposed to turn, you don't spend much time on final, and that's okay if you're doing everything else okay.
Right. Just keep everything the speed down and everything. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. All right. Now, I've already responded that we can't recommend, but we can mention some of the resources out there, as our English friend would say. Can anyone give me a recommendation for an online ground school for my son who is 15 years old?
So having done, I reviewed a lot of these for the for our initiative here for flight training, and they're all good. It's really just what is the personality that you want. I mean, some people will just can't stand one of the particular products, and you know, other people love it. And so it's really, you know, what it is you're looking for. I mean, Sporties is great. It's a very professional presentation. The Kings have you know, a long-standing great program that has a lot of good memory hooks in it. Somebody like Jason Schappert with M0A, he has a much more like upbeat, faster presentation. So you know, any of those and a lot of others. Gleim has a good. It's more like online ground school.
Rob Machado's got all video based now that he's doing.
Oh, okay. I didn't know he had all video now. That's great. Rob Machado's materials are excellent. So all of those are good. Do you have any others, Pat, that you can think of?
No, you pretty much covered all of them.
Yeah. Oh, Jepson. Okay, Jepson. You know, that like especially for the more like academically oriented professional pilot tracks, those are really popular, and they're really textbook like, you know, pretty much definitive.
Oh, if we're mentioning all those things, we might as well mention Gleim too.
Yeah.
Exactly. Absolutely. And ASA,
All
I
right,
believe.
ASA too.
You've talked about this a little bit, but I'm a rusty pilot, and when flying with an instructor for my BFR last year, he was very particular with turns in the pattern. He was very conservative with the amount of degrees in the turn, explaining the risk of stall whilst turning. Oh, I love that, whilst turning. This seems like a difficult judgment call. This seems like a difficult judgment call in downwind to final, and one that can be easily overlooked. Any recommendations on this?
So, Pablo, you must have been petting your cat when we covered that one before.
Yeah, we definitely talked about it. Yeah.
What did I just say? I said we talked about it already, but it's a question.
That was the question I was addressing, though. Yeah.
Don't go long-winded. Just cover it.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't turn too much. That's pretty much what we said, right?
Yeah.
Not too much or too little. Turn the right amount to get to where you need to go.
I like that. That summarizes it well.
Okay.
All right. Can an MEL-CFII give an IPC in a single engine land if the pilot is acting as the pilot in command but not instrument current?
This goes back to my. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so we're talking about a multi-engine instructor. Who is,
I saw that one. I think it's a multi-engine land. I don't know if they're a multi-engine land CFI or not, but they're an instrument instructor, maybe multi.
Right. It just says
IPC in a single. Yeah.
So So here's the secret, you know, and what people think that flight instructors and DPEs are all knowing, but you know, right now Pat would be reaching for his aim and like trying to sort this out because nobody actually knows all this stuff off the top of their head. You have to look it up.
Yeah, and in fact, I know who does know this one because I know that there is an FAA letter of interpretation out about this. I cannot remember what it says, but our Pilot Information Center, if you call 1-800-USA AOPA, I know that those guys know that. So yeah, I would definitely say give them a shout, because unfortunately I can't pull that one out of the top of my head, but I know that they know it because I know they got the letter of interpretation. They'll be able to email it to you and get that information to you, because I know they know the answer to that one.
Good advice, Chris. All right.
So we've gotten several ADSB questions, and I asked for clarification on a couple of them because someone just said, can you please talk a little bit about ADSB? I'm like, big topic. So one person specifically asked about ADSB traffic delay. So if you can discuss that, along with if you don't have ADSB, what are some of the areas you can and cannot fly with?
When it's required, basically, yeah.
Well, basically, anywhere you have to have a mode C transponder now, you have to have ADSB. If you want to be very specific about it, it's going to be class Echo, class Charlie, class Bravo, class Echo. I think it's above 10,000 feet, right?
Yep.
And there's also a provision
above Bravo.
Above Bravo. There's a provision if you're flying offshore. I don't remember what the detail is on that one. And there's also an exemption if you're flying above 10,000 feet, but you're below 2,500 feet AGL. It's not required. I'll tell you what, there are some really good FAA publications on that. I think we have one too. But if you Google ADSB requirements, there's going to be a whole list of things that will take you to some pretty good illustrations of where it's required and where it's not. But basically, wherever mode C is required now, so is ADSB.
I'm seeing a question that popped up that I want to answer, and it says, I'm currently working on my flight review after having not flown since 1994. I'm in my 9th hour of this review and have not been signed off. What advice do you have for me? And he said he has a total of 230 hours in an instrument rating. Well, and so, it really depends. I mean, 1994 is a long time ago, and 230 hours is not that a lot of experience. So, it's not necessarily out of line yet, but I will answer, and then I'll throw it over to the other guys. Just talk to your instructor and say, what am I doing well? What am I not doing so well? And, what is your plan for, when we should get there? And just have those, frank, straightforward conversations. And to me, that would be the first step. What do you think, Chris?
I would definitely talk to the instructor. And in fact, one of the things you could very much lay out is maybe you're going to use the ACS, the old PTS that's now the Airman Certification Standards. Maybe that's the idea. You're going to be doing select maneuvers out of there and to those standards for whatever certificate you hold. And so talk to them, saying like, in other words, lay out what are the things that I need to be able to do that show that I'm proficient, and that way you can come up with a training program, and especially to save yourself some time and money too. So that way, if you know those specifically, you can be working at home using an AOPA course or other ground schools or a simulator or whatever it might be to help you practice there as well to get back to where this person feels like you need to be. And if you feel they're being unreasonable, you can always, sort of like you go to a second opinion for a doctor, go to another CFI and see if they would agree.
Well, his clarification when I asked, he says there wasn't really anything particular, but he said first instructor left for United, next instructor pulled out the ACS and said that all boxes needed to be checked off.
So again, so yeah, it's the question of do you need to do all that? I don't know that has to do everything in the ACS, but it's talk to your, and in fact, maybe finding an older CFI that's not going anywhere, that's not going to be going off to the airlines might be something for the consistency part of it.
Well, the guy that went to United is probably coming back really quickly, so. What?
That's cold, dude. It is cold.
Pablo.
All right, let me turn the air down. Okay. All right, so is it okay to turn straight to the runway right after tower has cleared you to land on runway, whatever?
Fly the pattern. I mean,
yeah, you can do that. Sometimes the tower will actually say fly straight to the numbers, and I mean that pretty much tells you right there. But I would fly a squared off pattern if that were. Oftentimes first of all, oftentimes that you're going to get a straight in approach if you're anywhere halfway lined up for that. but you might get the something about, report a 3-mile right base or something. And if you report a 3-mile right base and he clears you to land, he or she, to be politically correct, clears you to land, then, turning towards the runway and kind of catty-cornered, to get kind of lined up for a final approach, fine.
Yeah, I think to mention what a pattern is for. I mean, it's to get you to that window, right kind of at the threshold, and you've got to fly through that window. Else you don't know where you are, what you're doing, and without it's really a way to compensate for lack of experience, and because eventually you might get to where you can handle these different type of approaches, but especially in the beginning phases early in your flying career, the more consistent you make that, the more consistent your landing is going to be, and I think that's what the pattern's for.
I'd agree, and if in doubt, ask the ATC what it is they want. But I'd agree with Keith that keeping it so it's the same for you every time, because I can't tell you how many times I fly with people and we end up getting a straight in for Frederick, which is a towered field, and we'll end up coming straight in from out of the pattern, and they have a heck of a time knowing when to start descending. So it's because they don't know the judgment because they're so used to doing it from downwind to base to final.
Yeah. Do we have anything else interesting, Pablo?
Yeah. So this was actually more of a question about your first story, Pat, about the clogged line. So people want to know how that could happen if everything is sealed within a fuel line.
Without going into an 18-minute story, which you can see, by the way, on In the Hangar, which is a YouTube channel, this airplane had been damaged in a landing accident and had been disassembled for about 2.5 or 3 years, with some of those fuel lines open to the air. And the mud dauber had taken up residence at some point during that period of time and built a mud nest, and the mechanic that reassembled the airplane didn't catch it. And there's more to the story than that, but bottom line is that it wasn't possible to tell that the fuel line had been blocked off during a pre-flight.
Gotcha. Okay. I think, again, they were coming pretty fast and furious. So if I missed something, I apologize, but I think I got most of the ones that were pertinent here, related to the topic at least.
Okay, sounds good. Well, and we do look through the questions at the end to see if there's anything that we need to pick up, and you can send emails into us. We do read that inbox for the most part. Sometimes it gets flooded with a lot of junk, but anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. We presentations. What's that?
We lost
you. Cut out there for a bit. Can you just repeat that?
Yeah, I was just saying that we will check the questions, and that we really do have a good time doing these presentations. We are glad you're here. We look forward to seeing you next week, which is the 4th and not the 3rd. But anyway, next Thursday at noon Eastern, we will be here and ready for you. Thanks, Pat, so much for coming on and sharing your great deal of expertise and stories and understanding. As always, it has been a pleasure. All right.
Fun. Thanks for asking.
Absolutely.
Cool. Yep.
Well, guys, that's it for this week, right?
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Okay. All right, we're out of here. Thanks for stopping by.
See you, everybody.
See you.